So the title of this teaching is Risk and Responsibility. And I thought of it long before the events of the day happened. And uh, one thing we know that God is love, says that very clearly and straightforward in the New Testament. God is love, and love is messy. And one of the things that love does is love gives free choice and responsibility to people. And when God created the heavens and the earth, he built risk and responsibility into the fabric, the very fabric of society. And we see that him starting out and creating the angels in the spirit world. And he created the spirit world, certainly the angels, with free will. What do we find in the book of Revelation? Revelation chapter 12, a third of the spirit world rebelled against God. They made the choice to rebel against God and to serve under the devil, the person we now know as the devil, instead of God. And that's one of the reasons that we now on this earth have to deal with demons. And then historically, we see person after person choosing to serve the devil for the immediate rewards rather than choosing to serve God for long-term rewards. Obviously, Adam and Eve chose to go the devil's way rather than God's way, which is why we're in such a mess. Cain, for example, in Genesis 4, chose to serve the devil rather than serving God. Through the Old Testament, the people called the sons of Belial chose to serve the devil. In the New Testament, those who are called children of the devil, or as he spoke to the Pharisees, your father the devil, those people chose to serve Satan instead of God. And there are people all over the world that make that choice. And then there are people like us, and we choose to serve God. And that comes with a risk, and it comes with a responsibility. And part of that risk is, like I say, it's embedded in life itself because life requires choice. And so what God did was, in giving us his word, he gave us things that would guide us so that we could live godly, so that we could make godly decisions. So let's start in Exodus chapter 21. The 10 Commandments, obviously, in Exodus chapter 20, give us a lot of very foundational things about having a good society, like don't steal, don't commit adultery. And of course, if we want God's blessing, don't have other gods besides God. I can get God's point. It's like if you're a husband or wife, you don't want your spouse having a lot of other husbands or other wives. There's some great value in being a one and only, and God wants to be our one and only God. So in the 10 Commandments, there are many real basic principles about having a godly society. And then what God is going to do, starting at Exodus chapter 21, and going to be Exodus 21, 22, and 23, he's going to give a whole set of various laws upon which Israel can build a society. And God is good in the sense, if you look at this chronologically, God knew he was going to take the leader that they trusted, Moses, who'd been really their rock ever since he went back into Egypt and started confronting Pharaoh. Moses had been the undisputed leader and rock in Israel. God wanted to live among the Israelites, and he wanted to do so in a tent that we know as the tabernacle. And in order to build that perfectly, and the rituals surrounding that magnified him and made him known, he took Moses away for 40 days and 40 nights. And so it's instructive to us that before God even took Moses away, he gave 3 chapters of rules and regulations about how to run a society. So when Moses was gone, supposedly they could run it. Of course, what we learned is they didn't learn squat. Moses goes away, and while he's gone, what do? They build a golden calf. They're worshiping it. They're playing, which was euphemistic for they were committing adultery, and various kinds of sexual things like that. So Israel became a mess without Moses, and that's really too bad. And what we'd like is for our independent countries, the countries of the world, to follow God's laws and not become like Israel when Moses was gone. So in Exodus chapter 21, God's going to start off and he's going to say, now these are the ordinances that you are to set before them. And there's a couple things we want to know about this. This is not the word Torah, this is the word mishpat, which is the word law. Now it becomes important for you and I in reading the Old Testament, particularly the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, to realize that Torah does not mean law. It means instruction. This word here that's translated ordinances, mishpat, that means law, or more accurately means law. Torah means instruction in the sense that it's instruction and guidance, and that instruction and guidance comes in a lot of different forms within the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. It comes as little laws and ordinances. It comes as examples of great people. It comes as of examples of evil people. It comes as customs, various things through the 5 books of Moses that instruct us, if we study it, on how to build a godly society and then how to live ourselves godly within that society. So God starts by saying, so these are the mishpat, these are the laws that you are to set before them. And then he starts right off in verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve 6 years, and in the 7th he is to go out free without paying anything. I hate the word slave. Unfortunately, it is the word that they used. But the problem is that has been, I will say it's been morphed or gone through a metamorphosis or a change due to the slavery, the Western slavery, whether that slavery was in Europe, whether that slavery was in the Muslim country, whether that slave was the black slave here in the United States, where slavery represented ownership. And it's very clear that biblical slavery does not involve ownership. Ownership was not a part of the concept of biblical slavery, this kind of slavery. In this case, slavery was more like an indentured servant, because the slave came in with, first of all, he had a 7-year sentence. He was going to be released in the 7th year. He could make decisions. He could buy property. He could get married if he wanted to. There were a lot of privileges to a slave, including the fact that if he didn't like the way you were treating him, he could run away. And if he got far enough to run away, where's it says Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15 and 16. In Deuteronomy 23, 15 and 16, if your slave runs away, you can't send after him and go get him. He's not to be brought back to you. That tells you a lot about slavery in the biblical world, that for the most part, slaves were well treated. It doesn't mean they had a cush life, but it means they were treated well enough that they didn't run away. Also, like, for example, if you go to prison in the United States, you might go to prison for 20 years and then finally be released. And when you're released, what do you have? Nothing. They don't provide you a car. They don't provide you a job. They don't give you any money to get started. You know, in the slavery in the biblical world, if you read Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 to 15, when the 7th year came and you released this slave, then you had to provide him with the material to get his life started. You couldn't just dump him out of your driveway and say, okay, you're on your own, goodbye. You had to make sure he had the provisions to get a good start so he didn't end up back in slavery again. So when we're talking here about slavery, it's important we understand how it works, so that then we can properly in our mind build a model from this. And so one of the things we learn is, and I like what James Jordan does in a book called The Law and the Covenant, he says the Hebrew slavery was almost more like an educational indentured servitude. That when the slave worked for the owner for 7 years, and the owner knowing he's going to release this slave with enough stuff to get started, that what the slave is paying attention to, how do I do it right? Obviously, the first time around, I screwed up. I got in debt or I stole something and couldn't pay for it, something like that. There was a reason the slave ended up as a slave. And so the idea is that when he's released, this doesn't happen again. So the point was that the Hebrew slavery was actually, in fact, worked out many times to be a kind of an educational system. One of the reasons Hebrew slavery worked was that dangerous criminals were not enslaved. If you were a murderer, if you were a kidnapper, if you were a rapist, if you were a person who's genuinely dangerous, they didn't enslave you, they simply executed you. And we learn that from the law. So the people that you're enslaving, so to speak, are the kind of people that if we put in a prison, work system for 7 years, they'd figure life out and then they'd be better off. That's the idea here. So verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew slave, and it's important to know that the master bought the slave. That's going to come up later. That's important. The master invests money in the slave. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he's to serve 6 years. In the seventh, he's to go out free without paying anything. And then the other things about it are in Deuteronomy and in other places through the scripture, like supplying him with stuff. That's in Deuteronomy. Not allowing anybody to come drag him back if he runs away. That's in Deuteronomy as well. Then verse 3, if he comes in by himself, he's to go out by himself. If he's married, then his wife is to go out with him. So in other words, if a person gets in trouble enough that he's a slave, he brings his family along. He doesn't leave his family back. The slave wasn't separated from his family. That's pretty important to understand. But verse 3, if he comes in by himself, he's to go out by himself. Because verse 4, if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children will be her master's, and he must go out by himself. And that would be ridiculously painful. I can't imagine leaving children. So here's part of the risk. Here's part of the responsibility. Okay, you've messed up. You've gotten yourself in debt. You can't pay it. Now you're a slave for 7 years. You're single. You're young. You just kind of made foolish mistakes or whatever. And so you say, yes, I want to be married. Well, that comes with a risk. You can wait 7 years. Jacob waited that long to get married to his wife in the book of Genesis. You can, as a human being, you can wait 7 years and then get married, perfectly permissible, everything above board. But if your master is going to supply you with a wife, that wife belongs to your master. Oh, and then come the tears. The 7th year, okay, you have to leave now. Oh, but my wife. And this is where, see, what happens is if we don't learn to think like God thinks and draw boundaries in life, then what happens is we get sucked in to our emotion. It's like, oh, I guess, yeah, the law should say that the wife has to go with the husband. No, the master provided the wife. He didn't have to. The slave asked for it. And so one of the things that the person who learns to think like God thinks has to do, they have to toughen up their mind and draw boundaries. Because here, if you were a judge in Israel and the slave comes to complain to you, the master won't give me my wife. You just say, you know what? You didn't have to take a wife. You knew the law before you decided to do that. And now the consequence is you've got to follow the law. And that's the way that we need, as Christians, we need to learn to think. It's the same thing about salvation. You probably know, I know, a lot of nice people. They're nice people. They're good people. Have they accepted Christ? No. On the day of judgment, are they going to be saved? Are they going to have everlasting life? No. You and I know what the Bible clearly says in the New Testament. If you want to live forever, you accept Christ. That's one of the reasons that we have to be aggressive evangelists, because we know what their destiny is. They don't. And we've got to press in and pray for these people and help by speaking to them about the logic of accepting Christ. Because on the day of judgment, they can stand in front of the throne of judgment and say, but I was a nice person. I was a nice person. They sinned. In fact, not only did they sin once, they probably sinned a whole bunch of times. And the wages of sin is death, and the Bible is very clear about that. So you and I, it takes boundaries and it takes clear thinking to take our mush minds and make them think like God thinks. I ran into a really hard one of those a little later in the chapter as we keep going here. Then the slave, of course, at that point can make a decision. Verse 5. But if the slave says, yes, says. Now, the Hebrew repeats the word says twice for emphasis because the slave has to say it. The master can't say, well, I thought that's what he was thinking, or whatever it happened to be. If the slave says, says the Hebrew text twice. We translated, if the slave says, yes, says, I love my master. And again, remember that in this system, it's designed so that the master treats the slave fairly, justly. If the slave says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master is to bring him to the judges, and it will bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master is to bore his ear through with an awl, and he will serve him forever. So the slave gets an earring, and then he's going to be a slave in that household for his lifetime. And that's, again, that's, risk and responsibility. If you decide you want to keep your family together, and if you decide you like your master and he does a much better job of running your life than you do, then you can make the decision to serve him forever. But if you make that decision and after 5 years you say, I don't want to do this anymore, it's too late. You already made that decision. So he gets his ear bored through and he serves forever. Verse 7. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, because one of the options for getting out of debt in the biblical world was you could sell your children into slavery. Remember, the master buys them. So if in our world, you own $10,000, you can't pay it, and you're going to be sold for your slavery. You get 3 kids, you sell off your kids. And whoever buys them gives you money, you pay your debt, and you're out of debt, and your children become slaves for the 7 years. And that's the way the system worked. That's the way the culture works. But it was different for women than for men. Why? Because it was assumed in the culture that the master would have sex with the female slave. It was just simply assumed. Whether it happened or not, didn't matter. The law was the law. So it says in verse 7, if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she is not to go out free as the male servants do. So the girl slaves served for their lifetime. And why was that? Verse 8, if she is unpleasant in the eyes of her master, who has designated her for himself. In other words, he bought her to have sex with her, for her to be a concubine, if you will, then he must let her be redeemed. And what does that mean? Now, he buys this girl, he has sex with her, whether she has children or not or whatever. All of a sudden, something changes in his life. He doesn't like the girl anymore. Then her family, or what we would call the kinsman redeemer, can step in and buy this woman out of slavery. So he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to a foreign people. And of course, the foreigners, the non-Israelites, didn't live by the Israelite law, did not worship God. And because the worship of God was of primary importance in God's eyes, you never had the right to sell a slave to a foreign country that was a pagan country. You had this sale has to be to Israelites who worship Yahweh. So he has no right to sell her to a foreign people since he has broken his commitment with her. And again, this is his responsibility. The high price bidder may be some Moabite or some Ammonite, tough. He has to sell her to an Israelite. That's part of the responsibility that goes. You marry the girl, you have sex with the girl, you don't like her anymore, okay, then you can sell her, but you can't sell her to a non-Israelite. She has to be sold into a situation where she can freely worship Yahweh. And then verse 9, if he designates her for his son, he must deal with her according to the rights of daughters. So, in other words, he buys this female slave so that he can give her in marriage or as a concubine to his son. He has to deal with her as if she's a legitimate married daughter, a daughter-in-law. Now, verse 10 and verse 11 are really important, and they reflect on the way modern Christians think about life. Because it says in verse 10, if he takes another wife to himself, he must not hold back her food, clothing, and conjugal rights. And conjugal rights is the sex that she deserves, because in that culture, what sustained people in their old age was their children. And as we learn from, for example, the children of Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah, who were Jacob's wives and concubines, the children almost universally supported the birth mother. It was common in that culture for a man to have more than one wife, and the children generally did not think of one big happy family. They thought of the birth mother. So for a man to withhold sex from his wife was basically threatening her in her old age. So the man is his responsibility. He married the woman. He took her for himself. He has to have sex with her. He has to give her the right to have children who will support her in her old age. So it says if he takes another wife to himself, he must not hold back her food, clothing. By the way, clothing is shelter. We learn in various parts of the law that poor people, for example, slept in their clothing. It served as their tent and their covering. So basically it's food, shelter, and sex. And then verse, which you and I would know as sustaining, what you need to sustain you in life: food, clothing, shelter, sex. Verse 11, for if he does not do these three things for her, she can go free without paying any money. Now, this is really important because in the culture of the time, men could divorce women, Deuteronomy chapter 24, but there's no provision for women to divorce men. And by the way, that cultural norm pretty much stayed in place through the New Testament times. If you were a wealthy woman in Rome, you could round up enough money and enough family support that women could, according to Roman law, in certain circumstances, divorce their husbands. But generally speaking, women could not divorce. Now, this becomes important in today's world, because today you have women in very abusive marriages where the husband is just outrightly cruel to the wife, and she goes to talk to the pastor, and the pastor says, well, the problem is, see, you can't really divorce him because we know from what Christ taught, for example, in Matthew chapter 19, that you can only divorce if there's adultery. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked on marriage and divorce, so that's all we teach for the rest of the morning. But it is worth taking a look at Matthew chapter 19. By the way, in divorce is covered, Jesus Christ covered divorce in I believe, all four Gospels, certainly 3 out of the 4 anyway. So there's different things stated about them. But if we look at, let's see, where did it get off to? Verse 3. Of Matthew 19, some of the Pharisees came to him, testing him, saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And if you follow the argument, that's always the argument for a man to divorce his wife. There's not a word in here, or in Mark, or in Luke, about a woman divorcing her husband. That becomes very important, because the question then is, how does a woman get out of an abusive marriage? And I know, I don't know personally, I know personally a couple of women. This is not, I'm not a called pastor, and I don't have a big church or anything, but I know there are women that feel trapped in a very abusive marriage because the husband has done everything horrible except commit adultery. And the woman goes to the pastor, and the pastor's like, well, you can't leave because he hasn't committed adultery yet. And that does not reflect on the New Testament teaching and the Old Testament law. And it's important for us to know that when Jesus Christ spoke. He spoke about what they were talking about. When can a man divorce his wife? And it's important that Jesus Christ did not say, by the way, everybody stop for a second. I need to correct Moses. That's not what's going on here. So what we're seeing is a different side of the marriage situation where if a man is horribly abusive to a woman and she's not getting necessary food or nourishment or sustenance, no clothing, the man quit having sex with her years ago, that kind of thing, it says she can go free without paying anything. A woman has a right to walk out of that kind of marriage. She's a human being. In the same way, the slave can run away. He can be so mean to the slave runs away, and then the master can't take him back. The law in Deuteronomy, the same thing here. If a husband is horrible to a wife and won't provide her with what she needs to sustain herself, and he refuses to have sex with her, then she can leave. And so that reflects on our modern culture. We should be aware of that. Okay, so onward to verse 12. Anyone who strikes a person so that he dies must be put to death. Yes, death. And so basically, what a lot of times what happens is we have a society and the devil has engineered our society. The devil is constantly trying to engineer society so that it's ungodly. And the devil has kind of engineered our society where expressing your feelings becomes of the utmost importance. It's so important that we express our feelings. Well, sometimes, you get mad at somebody, you can express your feelings by shooting them, by hitting them with a rock, something like that. And here's verse 12. Anyone who strikes a person so that he dies must be put to death. Yes, death. And that's, we get later on, we get into eye for eye, life for life, that kind of thing. And then verse 13, but if it was not premeditated, but God lets him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place where you can flee. Now, this becomes really important because it's a risk. If you're the kind of person who allows yourself to get angry and act on that anger, and you don't get counseling, and you don't go to your pastor or counselor or friends and say, my anger is a bit out of control. I am concerned that I could do something that would get me in a lot of trouble. In the biblical world, you get angry at somebody, pick up a rock and hit them, and it's like, oops, they died. Then they're going to haul you out and kill you. And that's as simple as it is. But it was an accident, but I didn't mean to. But it was, it's like, sorry, you picked up a rock. That's a purposeful action. And you hit somebody and they died. We're killing you. We don't need your kind on this planet. You make society unsafe. You make people live in fear. You have no right to make other people feel unsafe. You have no right to make other people live in fear. We're removing you from the planet. That's God's law. And this is where we need to be less mushy. Now, we do know there are times when there's accidental killing. For example, you're a roofer, and you're hammering nails and you set the hammer down and it slides off the roof and it falls down and cracks the skull of the guy who's working below you and he dies. Okay, that's clearly an accidental killing. Does the law make provision for that? Yes, it does. So then we read. It says in verse 13, if it was not premeditated, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place where you may flee, where you can flee. Now, what is that? That's called the city of refuge. And if we study, and you can read the commentary on Exodus 21 about this, but you study the city of refuge, the person was allowed to go and live in the city of refuge, and the avenger of blood, the people from the family or the town of the person that is dead, when the avengers of blood come, they're not allowed to take you out of the city of refuge and execute you. So you could stay in the city of refuge. But there were only 6 cities of refuge in all of Israel. If you say, well, I don't want to live in any of those cities, tough. Do you want to live? There's the risk and the responsibility. And if you want to stay alive, then you go to a city of refuge. Well, how long do I have to stay there? You have to stay there until you read, again, read the commentary, you'll get the verses, but you had to stay there till the high priest died. Well, wait a minute. What if the high priest just took over last year? That could be the rest of my life. Yeah, it could be. Or, who knows? The high priest may get, pneumonia and die in 2 years, and you can go free and live where you want in 2 years. Again, risk and responsibility. And what we find out is that a lot of accidents wouldn't happen if the consequences for the accidents were carried out in society. For example, if you set a heavy hammer on a sloped roof and then go, oops, it slid off. Well, if you realize that, if that hammer falls on anybody and hurts them, I'm going to be responsible. If it just wounds them, you're responsible to pay their expenses until they're healed. If it kills them, you've got to go live in a city of refuge. All of a sudden, you know what people are going to do? They're going to find a safe place to put their hammer when they're done with it. A whole bunch of accidents in the United States happen because there's no real consequence for most accidents. If there were serious consequences for most accidents, all of a sudden people would tighten up their lifestyle. And they wouldn't do, like if your car has trouble braking, you wouldn't park on a big, huge hill because you don't know that your car's brake isn't going to release. Your car is going to go careening down the street and kill somebody. Now that would be considered an accident. You'd have to go live in a city of refuge. But a lot of times it's just like a lot of times in the United States and in modern culture, there's no consequence for accidents, and as a result, there's a lot of accidents. I contend that if we would live like the Bible says, then there wouldn't nearly be as many accidents. So then basically you go through the death penalty a number of times and see different things. And I don't want to get into the whole pregnancy thing down into in verse 21. In verse 22. But there's extensive commentary on that. But then verse 23 becomes important. And verse 23, I can still remember back when I got born again in 1971. It was probably either late 71 or 72 that I started reading through the Bible and was reading through the Old Testament. And I remember specifically getting to this verse because all my life I had heard an eye for an eye. Even as an atheist, I had heard, it's an eye for an eye, and I thought that's what the Bible said. And then you get here to Exodus chapter 21, and verse 23 says, if any harm results, meaning that the whatever harm results when you punch out a pregnant woman, verse 23, but if any harm results, then you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And I remember thinking that and go, wow. That is so harsh. And I remember thinking to myself, one of those moments where you just kind of shake your head and it's like, wait, this is God's law. So he's right and I'm wrong. So it's not a matter of me at this point saying, oh, that's an old law, an antiquated law. It doesn't matter anymore. It's a matter of me learning to think to where that's my natural result. The whole point of reading the Torah, the instruction, is to begin to think like God thinks so you can act in society like God would act if he was here personally. And so one thing we do know is that when it says this life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, that actually in the biblical culture, this is something I didn't learn till much later, but actually in the biblical culture, what that was a set of upper limits. Because if you read the Assyrian law code, if you read the Mesopotamian law codes and things like that, what would happen is if, let's say, if a slave punched the master and knocked out a tooth, it wasn't tooth for tooth. They didn't knock out a tooth of the slave. They would kill the slave or whatever. So in the law codes of the surrounding nations, the pagan nations in the biblical world, the law codes favored the rich and the powerful against those who were poor. And God doesn't look at life that way. To God, it doesn't matter how rich you are or how poor you are. A person is a person, and their value should be the same. And so it doesn't matter if it's a slave that punches a master and knocks out a tooth. It's still just tooth for tooth. That's the upper limit of the law. And that's what this was. It was not given to be particularly punitive. It was given to protect the rights of the poor and the weak. And it set an upper limit on what could be done. And then as we move down to verse 28, if an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox must be stoned, yes, stoned. In other words, you don't talk about how good the ox is or how nice it was or whatever. It's killed. It just gored somebody. It's killed. And its flesh must not be eaten, but the owner of the ox will be held responsible. It amazes me in the United States today how many people have a dangerous dog that's known to bite people, and they number one are allowed in the society to keep the dog, and basically they get away with very little if their dog goes out and bites somebody. It's almost like the dog has to kill somebody for anything to be done. But this is a law by which in the world today we should use to regulate animals. Now we talk about risk and responsibility. If you're going to work around animals, particularly if you're going to work around an animal with horns, they are inherently dangerous. You know, they can hurt you in a moment's notice, with or without provocation, with or without any past history. So the risk that you take is if you're working around a dangerous animal. In the modern world, this would be working in dangerous situations. You know, if you decide to be a telephone pole lineman and you're climbing telephone poles all your life, that's a decision you make. Can it be dangerous? Yes. In our modern world, can we mitigate the danger by things like insurance, health insurance, life insurance? Yes. But can you make climbing a telephone pole not dangerous? No, you can't. But there's a lot of people who do it. It's a job that needs to be done. People are well paid. And so that's the risk and responsibility. And so here, the risk is, okay, I'm going to work around a dangerous animal. And all of a sudden, the dangerous animal becomes dangerous and gores you. And it says the owner of the ox will not be held responsible. Why? Because it had never behaved that way in the past. And it's a dangerous animal. So that's the risk. You make that decision. And then, you know, I think of people that ride bulls for a living. You know, the bull riding, the cowboys, and all that. And I don't follow that sport, so I'm not really up to speed on it. But if I remember correctly, it was either early this year, 2025, or last year, 2024, that a pretty well-known bull riding cowboy was stomped to death by the bull. Is that normal? No, not at all. They have event after event after event after event where the cowboys are all fine. But I mean, you're riding a 1.5 ton or 2 ton bull. So if it steps on you, is there a potential that you could die? Yes, it is. And you know, and if we were to run the world this way, God's way, then the owner of that bull would not be responsible, because you stepped into that ring of your own free will. So there's the risk of being hurt and the responsibility that if you are hurt, well, you made that choice to get into that situation. Verse 29 changes the situation. But if the ox had a habit of goring in the past, and its owner had been warned but did not keep over it, so it has killed a man or woman, the ox must be stoned, and its owner also must be put to death. That's the risk. Can you own a dangerous animal? Yes, you can. What's the risk? If it kills somebody, you're put to death. You are a danger to society. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be allowed to threaten society that way. If you've got a powerful dog that's been known to bite people, and you've been warned, you may have even gotten tickets, you may have even gotten a small fine about it, but you keep that dog and then it kills somebody. In the Mosaic Law, you take that dog owner and you put him to death, and you kill the dog. People are like, oh my gosh, that's so harsh. But it protects society. Some family just lost a family member because of your dog, which you knew was dangerous. You can't do that. Not in God's economy. Now, maybe in today's world in America, we let that happen. But believe me, in the millennial kingdom, that ain't going to be. There aren't going to be, as soon as your dog shows up dangerous, it's dead. It's a way we have a society that people are blessed to live in. People don't live in fear. They aren't afraid of going out on the street. Women aren't afraid of being alone at home. Somebody's going to break into their house and rape them. The fear in society, life becomes a blessing. That's the whole point of this. Is that this is how to run a society. So life becomes a blessing, a blessing. And then it goes on like verse 33, if a man uncovers a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must make restitution. He must give money to its owner, and the dead animal will be his. Now, what do we learn from that? Well, one thing we definitely learn from that is that when you say, it's my land, I can dig a pit on it if I want to. No, we don't have the right to create dangerous situations. That's one of the reasons we have the laws that if you own a swimming pool, you must build a fence around it because you don't have the right to have a pool that little kids can just walk into and drown. And you say, oh, it's their fault. It was on my land and it's my pool. You just can't do that. Biblically, you can't knowingly create situations that are decidedly harmful, inherently harmful. You can't create those type of situations. So I'm I'm going to stop the teaching here because I want to give time for sharing and reflection and that kind of thing. Um, but I would encourage you to take a look at Exodus chapter 21, 22, and 23, which have all kinds of various laws about how to run a godly society. And I've tried over the years to make sure that there's plenty of commentary to cover those situations. But you and I should desire to learn to think like God. And sometimes our society is so mushy that we don't end up thinking like God because sometimes the consequences for sin are things that we feel bad. If somebody's dog kills somebody, and we had to put that person to death, I'd feel badly for that person in a sense, but I'd feel worse for society if we allowed people like that to just be around and alive and that you never knew if a dog was going to kill you or not. And those are the decisions that we've got to make. And this is risk and responsibility. So we could call this risk and responsibility learning to think like God or learning to not be wishy-washy or something like that. But it's been a blessing to share this with you this morning. Again, we're in a difficult situation with what's going on in the world in the United States right now. So let's just keep up our prayers and keep evangelizing and keep praying that the Lord will come back quickly. So thank you so much for being here this morning. I really appreciate it and wish you all a great Sunday.